In Tucson, Arizona, for the past 58 days, it has been one of the most scrutinized pieces of geography in a missing person case that has gripped this country. Not because law enforcement declared it significant, not because an official press release pointed anyone toward it, but because a man with a camera and a methodical approach walked into it, documented what he found, and the world started paying attention. That wash runs behind the home of Annie Guthrie. Annie is the woman who reported Nancy Guthrie missing on the morning of February 1st, 2025. Her property sits at the center of an investigation that 58 days later still has no publicly identified suspect, no confirmed crime scene, and no answer to the question that Nancy Guthrie's family and thousands of people across this nation have been asking since that February morning. Where is Nancy? On March 28, 2026, day 56 of the search, an independent investigator walking that wash on foot found something. Multiple items of clothing, lying in the same drainage channel where others had already discovered a pair of pants weeks earlier. The sheriff was notified. The find was documented. Photographs were posted publicly. But what happened when deputies responded? What could those items mean for where Nancy Guthrie might have gone that night? And why does the location directly behind Annie's house change the shape of every theory people have been building in this investigation? That is what we are going to examine today. Because in cases like this, the details that seem small are never actually small. A wash, a jacket, a pair of pants, an independent searcher who goes back to the same stretch of ground a second time. These things matter. And right now, in this case, they matter in ways that law enforcement has not yet explained to the public. If you are following this case, if you want answers about what happened to Nancy Guthrie, then you are in the right place. This is Revealing Untold Crimes, and on this channel we do not look away from the hard questions. We follow the evidence. We examine the patterns. We hold institutions accountable when the facts demand it. If that is the kind of coverage you are looking for, take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe to the channel. We are going to stay on this case until there are answers. And your support makes that possible. Now let's get into what has been found, who found it, and why it matters so critically to understanding what happened to Nancy Guthrie. Nancy Guthrie was reported missing on the morning of February 1st, 2025. The person who made that report was Annie Guthrie. The relationship between Nancy and Annie has been central to this investigation from the beginning, though law enforcement has shared very little publicly about the circumstances that morning or what led to the missing person report. What we know is that Nancy Guthrie is an elderly woman. What we know is that she has been missing for nearly 2 months. What we know is that despite weeks of investigation, despite community searches, despite national media attention, there has been no publicly confirmed suspect, no arrest, no crime scene designation, and no clear explanation of what happened. The case is being handled by the Pima County Sheriff's Department, abbreviated as PCSD, with assistance from the FBI. Tucson, Arizona falls under Pima County jurisdiction, and this case has become one of the most visible investigations the department has handled in recent years. Visibility, however, has not translated into transparency. The public has received very few official updates. Press conferences have been limited, investigative details have been withheld, and the vacuum of official information has created space for independent investigators, online communities, and citizen searchers to step in and do the work that many believe law enforcement should have been doing more aggressively from the start. That brings us to the wash. Before we talk about what was found there, you need to understand what a wash actually is and why this particular geographic feature matters so much in a missing person investigation. A wash, also called an arroyo in some parts of the Southwest, is a natural drainage channel that cuts through the desert landscape. These channels are dry most of the year. Sometimes they stay dry for years at a time. But during Arizona's monsoon season, they can transform in minutes into raging torrents of water, moving with enough force to sweep away vehicles, shift boulders, and completely reshape the terrain. Law enforcement has been aware of this wash since early in the investigation. It has been a point of discussion in online communities for weeks. And on March 28th, it demanded attention again. Before we discuss what was found on March 28th, you need to understand who found it. Because the person making these discoveries is not some random individual stumbling around with a camera, Exploring with Jim is an independent content creator who has been conducting systematic grid searches in the greater Tucson area since this case broke in early February. He is not law enforcement. He carries no badge. He has no official role in the investigation. He has no institutional resources and no forensic equipment. What he has is a camera, a pair of boots, and the willingness to do something that formal search operations in this case have consistently failed to do. Get into the terrain, cover it on foot, and stay in it long enough to find what is there. Grid searching is exactly what it sounds like. You divide an area into a grid. You walk each section systematically. You document what you see, you go back, you go again. You do not assume that, because a previous pass found nothing, nothing is there. Wind moves things. Rain redistributes material. Vegetation can hide items that were not visible in a prior pass. And in a desert wash, where the terrain shifts with every storm system, what was not visible 3 weeks ago can be completely exposed today. Jim understands that principle, which is why he went back to the same wash multiple times. This was not Jim's first significant find in this investigation. A pair of pants previously recovered from this same wash, the same drainage channel behind Annie Guthrie's house, was a discovery associated with grid searching efforts in this area. That find drew attention. It was documented. It was submitted to law enforcement.
Women's pants. You know, when you're out here and you're searching, you find things, it's really hard, difficult decisions to make, you know what I mean?
And on March 28th, Jim returned to the same wash, the same general corridor, the same grid. This time he found more. Multiple items of clothing. Not one. Multiple. Just in the same location that had already yielded a prior discovery. When people who had been tracking this case online saw that Jim had returned to this wash and found additional items, the reaction was immediate. Those following the earlier pants discovery understood instantly what it meant that a second set of finds had come from the same location. In investigative terms, a single find can be explained as coincidence. A cluster of finds in the same defined area is something else entirely. And that is exactly what the wash behind Annie Guthrie's house is now producing. Jim's approach, the patience, the return visits, the methodical documentation, represents exactly the kind of discipline that has made independent investigators in this case into something more than spectators. He is doing the work. He is finding things. And he is making the calls to the sheriff that the evidence demands. There is a tendency in some corners of media coverage, and sometimes in official law enforcement communications, to dismiss citizen searchers and community investigators as amateurs who are contaminating active scenes, spreading misinformation, or making the official investigation harder. That concern may have theoretical merit, but, in practice, in this specific case, the record does not support it. The record supports Jim. The record supports the community. The record supports the people who went out and walked the washes when the official investigation was focused on managing press conferences and institutional credibility problems. What Jim has now given law enforcement twice is a documented finding in a defined geographic location. I'd photographed in place before being reported, submitted through appropriate channels, with a public record that cannot be retroactively denied or minimized. That is responsible evidence handling by a civilian, and it deserves to be treated that way. So let's talk about what was actually found on March 28, 2026. Let me be very precise here because precision matters in a case where misinformation can spread faster than fact-checked reporting. Everything I am about to tell you is sourced from a documented post made on the social media platform X on March 28, 2026. The pattern. This wash, the one behind Annie Guthrie's house, has now yielded multiple finds in the context of this case. A prior pair of pants. And now, on March 28th, additional clothing. What appears to be a jacket and more pants. Multiple items. Same drainage channel. Same geographic corridor. Different dates. In a missing person investigation, particularly one where the circumstances of disappearance are unclear, clustering of physical evidence in one defined geographic area is one of the most significant things investigators look for. It is how you establish a route. It is how you build a timeline. It is how you identify a site of interest and elevate it from background noise to primary focus. Multiple finds in the same location do not happen at random. A single item of clothing in a wash can be explained away. It blew there. It was dropped by someone passing through. It has been there for months or years and has nothing to do with the case. What the pattern demands is that we find out, and that brings us to a critical issue in this case, the institutional response, or more accurately, the lack of one that the public has been able to see. The Pima County Sheriff's Department has been notified of these finds. That sentence is doing a lot of work in this investigation, and we need to understand exactly what it means and what it does not mean, given the documented history of how PCSD has handled this case. Let me give you the record, because context matters here. Sheriff Chris Nanos has been the subject of a formal no-confidence vote from within his own department. Not from the outside, not from critics in the media or the public, from inside the organization, his own people. The deputies and personnel who work under him have registered formally that they do not have confidence in his leadership. That is not a small thing. That is an institutional rupture that speaks directly to how this investigation has been managed. Former Pima County Chief Deputy Rick Castigar, a man who knows this department from the inside, who knows its procedures and its culture and its capacity, has spoken publicly and on the record about concerns with how this case has been approached. He was specific. He was credible. He was on the record. Former Sheriff Dr. Richard Carmona, a man who held this exact job before Nanos, and who has the additional credibility of being a former United States Surgeon General, publicly stated that the crime scene in this case had been permanently corrupted. Permanently. Not damaged. Not compromised in ways that might still be recoverable. Permanently corrupted. Those are devastating words from a man of his standing, and they have not been satisfactorily addressed by the current administration of the Pima County Sheriff's Department. Against that backdrop, that documented, sourced, on-the-record backdrop of institutional failure, the statement that the sheriff has been notified carries a weight that goes beyond its surface meaning. It raises questions. Will the evidence be collected properly? Will it be analyzed? Will the results be shared with the public? Will this institution, which has already been accused of permanently corrupting a crime scene, handle critical new evidence responsibly? Those are not rhetorical questions. They are questions that the community following this case deserves answers to. Because if evidence exists that could tell us what happened to Nancy Guthrie, and if that evidence is not handled with the care and urgency it demands, then every day that passes without answers is another failure. Not just of this investigation, but of the basic duty law enforcement owes to a missing woman and her family. There is another issue that deserves attention here: the response time. How long did it take for deputies to respond to Jim's notification on March 28th? What did they do when they arrived? Did they collect the items? Did they photograph them independently? Did they secure the area? And did they expand the search radius to look for additional material? We do not have answers to those questions, and the fact that we do not have answers 58 days into a missing person case that has captured national attention is itself a problem. Transparency is not a courtesy in cases like this, it is a necessity. When a community is invested in finding a missing person, when independent searchers are doing the work, when evidence is being documented and reported through proper channels, law enforcement has an obligation to communicate what is being done in response. Silence creates suspicion, and suspicion, whether justified or not, erodes the public trust that is essential for effective investigation. There is also the question of what happens next. Assuming the items were collected, what is the timeline for forensic analysis? Are they being tested for DNA? Are they being compared against known samples from Nancy Guthrie? Is there fiber analysis happening? Is there any effort to determine how long those items have been in that wash, whether they were deposited recently or have been there for an extended period? These are standard forensic questions. The answers exist, the science exists. What we do not know is whether the work is being done, and if it is being done, when the public will be told what was found. In high-profile missing person cases, law enforcement often faces a difficult balance. On one hand, releasing too much information can compromise an investigation. It can tip off a suspect. It can contaminate witness testimony. It can create legal problems down the line. On the other hand, Releasing too little information alienates the community, fuels speculation, and in some cases, allows critical leads to go cold because the public does not know what to look for. The Pima County Sheriff's Department in this case has erred heavily on the side of silence. And that silence has consequences. It has consequences for Nancy Guthrie's family, who are living in a state of unimaginable uncertainty. It has consequences for the community, which wants to help but does not know how. It has consequences for independent investigators like Jim, who are finding evidence and reporting it. And
look at this though, you guys. Yeah, I don't even see that. You see these spots? I don't know, man. That looks like blood to me.
And then hearing nothing about what happens next. And it has consequences for the investigation itself, because when trust in law enforcement breaks down, cooperation breaks down with it. People stop calling in tips. They stop sharing information. So they start assuming that the official investigation is not capable of delivering justice, and they turn to other avenues. That is not a healthy dynamic for anyone. Not for law enforcement, not for the community, and certainly not for a missing woman who deserves every resource, every ounce of effort, and every investigative tool brought to bear on finding out what happened to her. So, where does that leave us? 58 days into the search for Nancy Guthrie, we have a wash that keeps producing evidence. We have an independent investigator who keeps finding it. We have a sheriff's department that keeps being notified. And we have a public that keeps waiting for answers. The pattern is undeniable. The geography is significant. The findings are documented. What we do not have is an official explanation of what those findings mean. What is being done about them, or when the people following this case will get the transparency they deserve. This is not the end of the story. This is not even the middle. This is the point where the evidence is accumulating, where the pressure is building, where the questions are getting harder to avoid, and this is the point where everyone watching needs to understand that the next steps matter. If you have been following the Nancy Guthrie case, if you believe that independent investigators like Jim deserve support, if you think that law enforcement agencies need to be held accountable when the facts demand it, then stay with this channel. Revealing Untold Crimes is committed to staying on this case until there are answers. We are going to follow the evidence wherever it leads. We are going to ask the hard questions. And we are not going to let this story disappear into the noise. If that matters to you, take a second right now to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your engagement tells the algorithm that this story matters. It keeps this case in front of people, and it ensures that we can keep doing this work. There is more to this story. Part 2 is coming. And in Part 2, we are going to examine what the institutional failures in this case tell us about what might have been missed in the critical first hours after Nancy Guthrie was reported missing. We are going to look at what former law enforcement officials have said about how this investigation should have been handled. And we are going to ask the question that more and more people are starting to ask. If independent searchers can find evidence in a wash that has been accessible this entire time, what does that say about the search efforts that should have been happening from day one? Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 58 days. Her family deserves answers. The community deserves transparency. And the evidence that is sitting in that wash, and possibly in a sheriff's department evidence locker, deserves to be analyzed, understood, and explained. Until that happens, we keep digging. We keep asking. We keep watching. Because in cases like this, the only thing worse than not knowing what happened is knowing that the answers might have been found if someone had just looked hard enough. Jim looked. He found something. Now we wait to see if the system will do what it is supposed to do with what he found. The sheriff has been notified. That sentence is doing enormous work in this investigation, and before we go any further, we need to understand exactly what it means and what it does not mean. Because in the context of how the Pima County Sheriff's Department has handled this case over the past 58 days, that notification is not reassuring. It is a question. We have been here before. Tips have come in. Fines have been reported. The community has surfaced information, submitted it through proper channels, and waited. And the public accounting of what happened to that information has been incomplete at best. So when Jim found these items in the wash behind Annie Guthrie's house and the sheriff was notified, the questions that follow are urgent. Did deputies respond? Did they go to the wash and physically examine the site? Did they collect the items? Did they bag them, label them, enter them into evidence with the chain of custody documentation that forensic analysis requires? Did they photograph the location independently, not just rely on the photographs that the citizen investigator provided? Did they cross-reference this find with the prior pants discovery in the same wash and treat the clustering as a pattern worth investigating? Did they involve the FBI, which has been engaged in this case from early on? We do not have documented answers to those questions yet. And that itself is a problem, because the public deserves to know how law enforcement responds to community-sourced finds in an active missing person case. Here is what the stakes are. If these items are collected, sent for forensic analysis, and the results come back connecting them to Nancy Guthrie, that would be a turning point. After 58 days of a case that has offered no confirmed crime scene, no confirmed timeline, and no publicly identified person of interest, a forensic connection between physical evidence and the missing woman would change everything. If the items are collected, analyzed, and determined to have no connection to the case, that rules out a theory. That is also valuable. An investigation is supposed to pursue leads and close them, not leave them open and unexamined in a wash behind a house that sits at the center of this entire mystery. And if those items are not collected at all, if the sheriff's department receives this notification and fails to respond with the seriousness that a second clustering of evidence in the same location demands, that is a story. And this community will tell it. And there is also a specific institutional dynamic at play here that needs to be named clearly. The Pima County Sheriff's Department did not voluntarily release the information about the prior pants discovery in this wash. The community surfaced it. The department did not proactively communicate to the public the significance of the wash behind Annie's house as a geographic focus of the investigation. The community determined that. And now, with a second documented find in the same location, the community is again at the front of this information chain. Law enforcement is again in the position of responding to what civilians surfaced, rather than leading with what official resources found. That pattern, community finds followed by official response, followed by insufficient communication, followed by the community continuing to work, is the defining pattern of this investigation's first 58 days. And it is the context within which every statement that the sheriff has been notified must be understood. The institution has not earned the benefit of the doubt. The institution has earned scrutiny, and that is exactly what it is getting. Let's go back to the night Nancy disappeared, because that night, February 1st, 2025, is the night that everything in this case radiates outward from. And the wash behind Annie Guthrie's house is now pulling us back to it in a way we cannot ignore. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She was reported missing from her home on the morning of February 1st. The call that morning, the call that started this investigation, came in and set off a chain of events that we are still, 58 days later, on working to understand. What happened before that call? What happened in the hours overnight? Where was Nancy? Did she leave on her own, or was she taken? Did she leave at all? Or did what we are looking at happen somewhere closer to home than law enforcement has publicly acknowledged? These are not fringe theories. These are the foundational questions of this investigation. And the physical evidence that is now clustering in the wash behind Annie's house forces us back to them. What we know about that night is what did not happen. There was no surveillance footage that clearly captured Nancy leaving. No ring camera that caught her walking down a driveway or a sidewalk. No neighbor's camera that placed her on a street. No vehicle that was confirmed to have transported her. The absence of a clear exit route for an 84-year-old woman has been one of the most persistent puzzles of this case, because people do not simply vanish from inside homes without leaving some trace of how they left. Unless the route they took was one that surveillance did not cover. The back of a property. A fence line. A wash that runs through residential terrain without cameras, without streetlights, without pavement that holds footprints the way concrete does. In the dark, with knowledge of the terrain, a route through a wash behind a house is a path that disappears from the evidentiary record almost immediately. That is what the geography of the wash behind Annie Guthrie's house represents in investigative terms. A path that surveillance did not see. See, a corridor that forensic attention is now being pulled toward for the second time. a location that is no longer a single anomaly, but a pattern. Retired FBI Special Agent Steve Moore has spoken about this case publicly and has discussed, in the context of other nobody missing persons investigations, the investigative technique of working backward from physical evidence to determine a route. You find an item. You ask how it got there. You trace the most probable path backward from discovery point to origin point. You factor in the terrain, the timing, the conditions, and you build from there. The wash behind Annie's house is now offering investigators 2 data points in that backward tracing process. A prior find of pants, a March 28th find of a jacket, and additional pants. Multiple items, same location. The investigative logic of working backward from that cluster points consistently, inevitably, toward the property at the top of that drainage channel. That is not a conclusion about what happened on February 1st. That is a direction that the evidence is pointing. And 58 days into a case with no confirmed crime scene and no publicly identified route of movement, a direction is significant. Let me also put this in context of what we know about the timeline that night. Nancy was reported missing in the morning. Whatever happened, whatever events unfolded, happened in a window that we still cannot precisely define. The hours between the last confirmed sighting and that morning phone call represent the entire mystery of this case. Nighttime movement through a wash is not the same as daytime movement through a wash. At night, in a residential area without strong ambient light, the level of concealment that terrain like this provides increases substantially. What would be visible in daylight, movement, shadows, the shapes of people or objects, becomes almost invisible in the dark of a Tucson residential neighborhood. And a wash that runs behind a house and away from streetlights is about as dark as outdoor terrain gets in an urban area. The February 1st timeline, the geography of the wash, and the now documented pattern of clothing finds in that wash are 3 threads that, taken together, define the most pressing investigative priority in this case as of day 58. The physical evidence is in the wash. The sheriff has been notified. And what happens next is not in the community's hands. And it is in the hands of an institution whose record in this investigation has already been called into question by people with far more standing to judge it than anyone in this community has. If you have been following the Nancy Guthrie case, you already understand that the community investigating this disappearance has been ahead of official channels more times than not. The work that independent investigators, content creators, and engaged citizens have done in this case deserves recognition. And if you believe that too, this is the moment to show it. Like this video right now. Subscribe to Revealing Untold Crimes if you have not already. Because we are not going anywhere. We are staying on this case, following the evidence, asking the questions that need to be asked, and holding institutions accountable when the facts demand it. Your support makes that possible. Now let's talk about what this community has actually accomplished. Something that this case has demonstrated more clearly than almost any case in recent memory is the role that citizen investigators, independent content creators, and an engaged online community can play when official channels have failed to produce answers at the pace the public demands and the situation requires. Let me walk you through what this community has done in this case, not in general terms, specifically. There was the FBI gun store name list information that surfaced through community channels, information about names associated with a specific inquiry which the community was tracking before law enforcement had publicly addressed it. There was the blood forensic analysis, specifically the donut-shaped blood drops and the indoor blood evidence that this community and independent analysts were discussing in detail long before any official forensic accounting was provided. The pattern of those drops, what they indicate about velocity and surface, what they mean for where blood originated and when. This community was doing forensic analysis that the Sheriff's Department was not publicly sharing. There was the University of Arizona athletics label spotted in evidence footage by an online investigator with the handle Chayam, who has 193,000 posts on the platform X, and who was so confident in her identification that she said so explicitly and stated she intended to submit it to authorities. That find came entirely from community analysis of publicly available footage. There was the flashlight in mouth behavioral clue, The tradesperson detailed that this community identified as a significant behavioral marker for a specific type of worker with a specific kind of site familiarity. And then there is the wash behind Annie's house, searched on foot, in the sun, in the brush, by a YouTuber named Jim, who goes back to the same ground again and again because he knows that terrain changes and that the first pass does not always get everything. None of these threads began with an official press release. Not one. Every single one of them originated in this community, in people watching, analyzing, grid searching, and applying real investigative logic to publicly available information. And every single one of them forced law enforcement to respond, acknowledge, or clarify. That is not a small thing. And that is citizen journalism at a level of sophistication and commitment that deserves recognition, not dismissal. And it raises a question that is worth sitting with. Why is the community finding things that formal, resourced, official investigations are not surfacing publicly? Exploring with Jim is a direct expression of that commitment. He has been out there in the terrain while the sheriff's department has been managing press conferences and institutional credibility crises. He went back to the wash because the data told him the wash was worth going back to. And he was right. Again. Whether law enforcement treats his finds with the gravity they deserve is the open question. The community's answer to that question has been consistent. We are going to keep watching, keep searching, and keep reporting, irregardless of what official channels do or do not do. Now, we need to talk about Savannah Guthrie, because her role in this case has been both public and deeply strategic. Savannah Guthrie has been the public face of the search for her mother since very early in this investigation. As a Today Show anchor, one of the most recognizable journalists in American television, she brought a level of media access and platform to this case that is unusual for a missing person investigation involving an elderly woman in Tucson, Arizona. And she used it deliberately, strategically, in ways that former FBI Special Agent Harry Trombitas confirmed were coordinated with law enforcement as an investigative tool. That coordination tells us something important. Savannah's public communications about this case have not been emotional and unplanned. They have been calculated, they have served an investigative purpose, and what she has said in her appearances has carried the weight of someone who knows more than she has publicly shared. Her Today Show interview was a turning point in how the public understood this case. Several things, she said, reframed the investigation in real time. She said investigators had stood over her bed. That is a specific, physical, visceral detail, not an abstraction. Investigators standing over a bed means investigators examining something specific about a sleeping space. That detail matters. It implies a defined focus within the physical space of the home, and it implies that focus was significant enough to conduct in a particular room in a particular way. She referenced responding to ransom notes, not dismissing them, not discounting them, responding, which means law enforcement determined they were worth engaging with. And that engagement shaped the early days of the investigation in ways the public was not fully informed about at the time. She described a family navigating something that has no clean resolution, no confirmed timeline, and no publicly identified person of interest. A family that has been given information they have not shared. A family that is managing a public narrative while also managing a private reality that, based on the evidence clustering in that wash, may be far darker than anything they have publicly acknowledged. Now, the wash behind Annie's house. Annie's house. Annie is the woman who made the call that reported Nancy missing. The woman whose property backs up to a drainage channel that has now yielded multiple clothing finds in an active missing person investigation. Annie Guthrie has not been named a suspect by law enforcement. No one has been publicly identified as a suspect in this case. We are not naming anyone here, and we are not implying a conclusion that the evidence does not support. What we are saying is what the geography says. The wash is behind Annie's house. The finds are in that wash. Those are facts. And in an investigation where we are all trying to understand how Nancy left or was moved without being captured on any surveillance, the geography of that wash and the clothing now found in it is a fact that cannot be responsibly set aside. Savannah returns to the Today Show on April 6th. Whatever she says then, and she will have had time to absorb these most recent developments, will be worth watching very carefully. This community will be watching, and this channel will cover it. Let me add one more layer of context here, because the family dynamics in this case have always been more complicated than they appear on the surface. Savannah Guthrie is a journalist by training and profession. She understands how information moves. She understands how audiences receive information. She understands what to say and, equally important, what not to say and when. Her public appearances in this case have been calculated, not spontaneous, and the things she has chosen to share and the things she has chosen to withhold are a map of their own kind. The wash is behind Annie's house. Annie is Savannah's family. And somewhere in the space between what Savannah has said publicly and what this investigation has produced physically in a drainage channel that runs off a backyard is the truth of what happened to Nancy Guthrie on the night of February 1st, 2025. We do not have that truth yet, but we are getting closer to the geography where it lives. And now, what I have been holding back since the beginning of this video, I told you there was something coming that would change the shape of everything we have talked about. I meant that. Here it is. The question that has defined this case for 58 days, from the very first morning that Nancy Guthrie was reported missing, is not where she is. It is not even who is responsible. The question that has been the hardest to answer, that has stymied every theory and frustrated every analyst and paralyzed every institutional response, is this. How do you prove what happened to someone when you do not have a body, you do not have a crime scene, and you do not have a confirmed route of movement? Nobody homicide cases, and the experts in this field have said this publicly, repeatedly, in this case and in others like it, turn on physical evidence. They almost always do. Not on confessions, not on eyewitnesses, on physical evidence that places someone, that documents movement, that connects a location to a victim in a way that survives forensic scrutiny and holds up in court. A piece of clothing, a fiber, a trace. The kind of material that a grid searcher walking the same corridor twice can pull out of a desert wash that official searches may have passed over because they were looking for something bigger, or looking for something obvious, or not looking at all. If law enforcement collects these items from the wash behind Annie Guthrie's house, and I want to be clear that we do not yet know whether they have, and if forensic testing returns results, and if those results connect this clothing to the night of February 1st, 2025, to Nancy Guthrie herself, or to any person or location relevant to this investigation, then the wash behind Annie's house becomes something different from what it is today. It becomes a scene, an actual, documentable, forensically supported scene in a case that has not had one. And it becomes evidence of how someone moved or was moved, evidence of a route, evidence of disposal or concealment, evidence that places the physical story of this case in a specific geography, in a drainage channel behind a specific property, in a way that law enforcement would be compelled to investigate seriously and completely. After 58 days, after a no-confidence vote, after a former United States Surgeon General said the crime scene was permanently corrupted, after every lead that seemed like it might break this open turned into another waiting game, a YouTuber with a camera went back to a wash and found more clothing in the same place. The sheriff has been notified. Now we wait to see what the sheriff does about it. And this community and this channel will not stop watching until there is an answer. And I want to be clear about what I am asking you to hold on to as you leave this video. Not a theory, not a conclusion, a framework. The wash is a location. The pattern of finds is a signal. The sheriff notification is a documented fact. And the question of what law enforcement does next is the test, not just of this investigation, but of the institution itself. If the Pima County Sheriff's Department collects this evidence, processes it, and communicates the results to the public with the transparency that this case demands, that is what accountability looks like. If the items sit unprocessed, unreported, unacknowledged, then the community that has been doing the work that law enforcement has not will have its answer about this institution. And that answer will be its own kind of evidence. And we have been at day 58 for long enough to know that hope and patience are not the same thing. This community is not passive. It is not waiting quietly. It is watching. Every press conference, every tip line, every wash. The sheriff has been notified. We are watching what comes next. Nancy Guthrie is still missing. That is the fact at the center of everything we do here, everything this community has built over the past 58 days, and everything that keeps people like Jim walking into a dry riverbed in the Tucson sun when it would be so much easier to look away. If you have been following this case, you already know how many of its significant developments have come not from official press releases, not from Sheriff's Department briefings, not from FBI statements, but from people. From people watching footage frame by frame, from people submitting tips, from people driving to Tucson and walking washes, from people on social media at midnight, tagging journalists and investigators and anchors by name, saying, "Look at this. This matters. Someone needs to see this." That is what this community has been doing since February 1st, and it has mattered every single time. Jim is part of that. What he found in that wash on March 28th, documented, reported to the sheriff, posted publicly so the world could see, is part of that tradition. It is citizen investigation at the level this case has demanded, and it deserves to be treated seriously by the institution that has been notified. The clothing in that wash is not going away. The questions about how it got there are not going away. And the community that has been driving this investigation forward when official channels stalled is not going away either. Let me walk you through what happens if the forensics come back positive. If testing confirms that the clothing found in the wash connects to Nancy Guthrie, to the night of February 1st, or to the circumstances of her disappearance in any documentable way, law enforcement would be facing a fundamentally different case than the one they have been managing for the past 2 months. They would have a physical scene. They would have a route. They would have material evidence that could support charges, that could support a prosecution, that could answer the question that has haunted this case from the beginning. How do you prove what happened when the person is gone and the scene was compromised from the start? The wash provides that answer, if the evidence supports it. And that is a very large if, because we do not yet know what forensic testing will show. We do not know if the items have even been collected. We do not know if they are sitting in an evidence locker waiting for analysis, or if they are still lying in that drainage channel waiting for someone to take them seriously. What we know is that the community has done its part. The find has been made. It has been documented. It has been reported. And now the ball is in the court of an institution that has not inspired confidence in its handling of this case. Former Sheriff Dr. Richard Carmona, who also served as United States Surgeon General, said publicly that the crime scene in this case had been permanently corrupted. Permanently? That is not a word someone of his stature uses lightly. And it means that whatever happened in the initial response to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, whatever decisions were made or not made in those critical first hours, the evidentiary foundation of this case was damaged in a way that cannot be undone. But a new scene, a scene discovered not by the initial responders, but by an independent searcher weeks later, a scene that has been documented from discovery forward with photographs and public records. That is a scene that starts clean. That is evidence that does not carry the contamination of whatever went wrong on February 1st. If the wash becomes that scene, if the forensics support it, then the community that found it will have done more than assist this investigation. It will have saved it. And that is not an exaggeration. That is the reality of nobody cases where the physical evidence is everything and the initial scene is gone. You find another scene. Or you do not solve the case. Jim may have found that other scene, and if he did, then the Pima County Sheriff's Department has an obligation to treat it with every resource, every expert, every ounce of institutional seriousness that it can bring to bear. Because if they do not, if this evidence sits unexamined while the days turn into weeks and the weeks turn into months, then the message to this community and to every community watching cases like this across the country is clear. The institution cannot be trusted to do the work, and the people will have to keep doing it themselves. That is not a sustainable model for justice. That is not how investigations are supposed to function. But it is the model this case has already established over 58 days of institutional failure, community persistence, and unanswered questions. Savannah Guthrie will return to the Today Show on April 6th. When she does, she will be speaking not just as a daughter searching for her mother, but as a journalist who understands the power of narrative and the weight of public statements. She will have had time to process these most recent developments. She will have had time to consult with law enforcement, with her family, with the people advising her on how to navigate the public dimension of this case. And what she says, or does not say, will be parsed by thousands of people who have been following every word, every detail, every shift in tone since this case began. This community will be listening. And because Savannah's statements have been coordinated with law enforcement from the beginning. That coordination, confirmed by former FBI Special Agent Harry Trumbitas, means that her public appearances are not just personal expressions of grief or hope. They are strategic communications designed to serve investigative purposes that the public is not fully aware of. When she speaks on April 6th, we will be listening not just for what she says, but for what she does not say. For the gaps in the narrative, for the details that get emphasized and the details that get avoided. Because in a case where the family is managing both a public story and a private reality, those gaps are where the truth lives. The wash behind Annie's house is not a peripheral detail in this case. It is not background geography. It is central. And the more we learn about what has been found there, the more central it becomes. Two separate discoveries, multiple items of clothing, same drainage channel, same defined geographic corridor. That is not random distribution. That is not environmental contamination that could have come from anywhere. That is a pattern. And patterns in criminal investigations are signal, not noise. They are the data points that tell you where to look, what to test, and what questions to ask. The question that the wash is now asking, louder than it was asking a month ago, louder than it was asking 2 months ago, is this: what moved through this channel? When did it move? And where did it come from? Those are not rhetorical questions. Those are questions that forensic science, geographic analysis, and investigative fieldwork are designed to answer. And the tools exist, the expertise exists, the evidence exists. What we are waiting to see is whether the will exists within the Pima County Sheriff's Department to use those tools, apply that expertise, and follow that evidence wherever it leads. Because if the evidence leads back to the property at the top of that wash, if it leads to a timeline that contradicts the official narrative, if it leads to a person or persons who have not yet been publicly identified as connected to this case, then the investigation changes. Not incrementally, fundamentally. And everyone involved, from the Sheriff's Department to the FBI to the family navigating this in public and in private, will have to reckon with that change. The community is ready for that reckoning. The question is whether the institution is. And Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 58 days. Every one of those days represents a failure to answer the most basic question a family can ask. Where is she? A failure to provide the transparency that the public deserves in a case that has captured national attention. A failure to match the investigative intensity and commitment that independent searchers like Jim have brought to this case from the beginning. 58 days is a long time to wait for answers. It is a long time for a family to live in uncertainty. It is a long time for a community to sustain the kind of energy and focus that this case has demanded. And yet, the community is still here, still searching, still analyzing, still holding law enforcement accountable, still refusing to let this case disappear into the background. That persistence matters. It matters because it keeps Nancy Guthrie's name in the public conversation. It matters because it creates pressure on institutions that might otherwise move on to the next case, the next press conference, the next crisis. And it matters because, in cases like this, the community is often the only force powerful enough to demand the answers that institutions are reluctant to provide. If you believe that this community deserves recognition for the work it has done, if you believe that independent investigators like Jim deserve support, if you believe that institutional accountability matters and that transparency is not optional in cases where the public has invested its attention and its trust, then show it. Like this video. Subscribe to Revealing Untold Crimes. Share this with people who care about this case. Don't drop your analysis in the comments. Tell me what you see in those photographs. Tell me what you think the pattern in that wash means. Tell me what you think the Sheriff's Department is going to do, and what you think they should do. Because this community finds things. This community holds institutions accountable when they fall short. And that is not nothing. That is something this case has proven again and again. We will keep watching. We will keep reporting. We will keep asking the hard questions until there are answers. Nancy Guthrie is not forgotten. Her family deserves resolution. The community deserves transparency. And the evidence in that wash deserves to be treated with the seriousness, the urgency, and the institutional commitment that a missing 84-year-old woman and her family have every right to expect. The sheriff has been notified. Now we watch what happens next. This is Revealing Untold Crimes, and we are not going anywhere. This video is produced for informational and educational purposes only. All information presented is based on publicly available sources, including documented social media posts, verified mainstream media reports, and on-the-record statements from named credentialed sources. Content is accurate as of the date of recording. No individual has been named or implied as a suspect in the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. All claims regarding unverified community observations are explicitly labeled as unconfirmed throughout this video. This channel has no affiliation with the Guthrie family, the Pima County Sheriff's Department, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or any law enforcement agency. If you have information related to the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, please contact the Pima County Sheriff's Department or the FBI directly.